I'm just going to put this up front. This controller, if purchased from AliExpress anyway, will set you back just £20, or £27 if you buy it from Amazon. That is ludicrously cheap. And yet, at least on paper, this looks like a near ultimate controller. Dual Hall effect joysticks, Hall effect triggers, 1000Hz polling rates, quad extra buttons on the back, locking triggers for FPS games, and even an internal gyroscope, so when you use this with a Nintendo Switch, it can do motion control. Seriously, everything about this says that it is an excellent bit of kit. Of course, the reality is maybe a little different, so let's dive in. This is the PXN P5, not to be confused with PSN, a straight Xbox One controller rip in terms of styling, but it's otherwise a pretty high-spec controller. As mentioned, the joysticks here are both using Hall effect sensors. Well, I'm sure that most of you know what that is and why it's great. For those that don't, in short, Hall effect sensors sense the strength of magnets. And in this case, the old potentiometers that we used to use in controllers like this, the physical wipers sweeping over a resistor, have been replaced by magnets and Hall effect sensors, which means that these joysticks will never drift or fail. How nice is that? Some might be grumbling in the comments about TMR, which still uses magnets but is a little more power efficient and accurate. TMR sticks are just a lot less common to find out in the wild right now. Once they are more available, I'm sure that the P6 or whatever will include them, but realistically there isn't all that much of a difference in terms of real-world user experience. The same goes for the triggers, although it's worth talking about the locking feature too. This is a feature that basically all third-party controllers seem to offer. Basically, there's a little lock on the back that slides inside the trigger cap to limit the travel. For FPS games, that is sort of easier to deal with, makes you in theory more competitive, and the joy of it being on a little sort of switch in the back means that if you want to, say, swap to a racing game where you want full control again, you can just slide it out. Some do this better than others though. Razer's newest Wolverine V3 Pro and the Nixie Master P1, another cheap Hall effect 1000Hz controller, review in the cards above, both don't just slide a bit of plastic in to limit the travel, they slide a micro switch in, so you now get a nice clicky button under the trigger. This P5 doesn't do that, it's just a travel lock. That's fine, especially at this price, but it's worth noting the difference anyway. And actually, speaking of differences, I should mention that everything is notably lower quality than especially the Razer options. The ABXY buttons are just regular mushy membrane style switches compared to Razer's nice mecha tactile clicky switches. The same goes for the bumpers, which again are just regular kind of mushy buttons compared to the nice clicky ones Razer offers. And again, the same with the D-pad, it's incredibly mushy and honestly kind of hard to tell you've pressed it. Although at least this is a circular design, which should in theory make it easier for the games that need to use that. In terms of feel and quality, the joysticks are a solid 5 out of 10. They move perfectly well with a sort of bearing ring on the outside for, in theory, smoother at the limits movement, but the tip is a less than quality feeling rubber overmolding, and unlike the admittedly power of 10 more expensive Razer controller, these tips are not replaceable. Now, if you consider this a throwaway bit of tech, then that won't be a problem. But thanks to the Hall effect joysticks, this doesn't have a built-in e-waste timer, so not being able to replace these tips, at least relatively easily, is a bit of a shame. Luckily, that's the only bit of rubber overmolding on the controller. The grips themselves are actually, at least on the backside anyway, are pretty grippy despite being just plain molded plastic, thanks to the sort of cubed textured finish. What's interesting is that the front and rear halves of the controller are noticeably different colours and obviously textures, something that's evident just by looking at it from the side. It doesn't really matter, although it does speak to the quality of the thing. Carrying on to the back, you'll find the other common addition to these third-party controllers: extra buttons. This one has 4, all arranged in a line, with the 2 outer ones being placed pretty well, basically where your middle finger rests when you're gripping the controller, but the 2 inboard ones are, well, considerably harder to reach. It isn't impossible, and they are even angled to, in theory, make it easier, but it still takes some effort. The switches under them are also a little underwhelming, as they aren't as clicky or tactile as perhaps I'd hoped. They're just a tiny bit on the mushy and loose side. It's not the end of the world, of course, but it isn't quite as nice as I'd perhaps like. I should note that just like the Nixie controller, which I wouldn't be surprised to find is a different skin version of very similar internals to this, has a small switch on the back that lets you toggle between PC via the little included dongle, phone Bluetooth in the middle, and Nintendo Switch on the right. That is a bit of versatility that even the Wolverine V3 Pro can't match, even if it's versatility that I personally don't find that much value in. It's nice to have the option, at least. And speaking of options, it turns out that the infinity symbol button on the front, in combination with various other inputs, lets you customize at least some of the controller's features without any additional software. You can toggle between X input and D input modes, enter or exit the air mouse mode just using the gyro inside as a mouse, adjust the motor vibration amount, program the rear buttons, and switch the joystick dead zones pretty much on the fly. That's pretty handy, right? You can download the very poorly reviewed PXN Android app to customize the controller more directly, although I wouldn't want to install a random app that needs location permissions just to customize an extra cheap controller. That's me personally. Actually, gaming on the thing was still a perfectly decent experience. It's clearly a cheap controller and feels it, but it plays well. The internal 1000 mAh battery should last for, at least according to PXN, around 28 hours of usage, although the more rumble you have, the lower that figure goes. For FPS games, the locking triggers do help, and the joysticks are well calibrated to give smooth and easy control and movement. I can't say that I'm a console player these days. I haven't been for, oh gosh, a decade and a half now, so my ability to comment, especially on FPS gaming performance of a controller, is perhaps somewhat limited. But at least from a layman's perspective, it feels decent, similar to the other controllers that I've tested recently anyway. For racing games though, I have more experience. Interestingly, Assetto Corsa is actually considerably harder to control with a controller than a keyboard, as all of the assists turn themselves off, and you actually need to pay very close attention to throttle and braking and especially smooth steering, which my variety of disabilities actually makes pretty hard. But for someone more able-bodied, this should still be a pretty decent experience. I did, of course, use my open source latency testing tool, available at osrtt.com, linked in the description, to test the latency of this thing, both wired and wirelessly, and I'm surprised and pleased to say that, at least when connected via a USB-C cable, this is pretty fast, at least when it comes to controllers anyway. It returned a 16.5 millisecond average when wired, which isn't too far behind the Wolverine V3 Pro wired, even in its supposed 1000Hz mode too. Wireless performance, again, is only 2 milliseconds behind the V3 Pro, which is to say, not amazing. 23.5 milliseconds is a fairly long time with peripherals, but that appears to be a common thing with controllers, so I can't hate this one in particular. So for your 20 to 30 pounds, it seems like you get a pretty decent bit of kit. Sure, it's nowhere near as premium as Razer's V2 or V3 options that I've tested. This feels noticeably cheaper outright, but it's also between a quarter and a tenth of the price. For that, you get a pretty decent wireless controller with wide device support, Hall effect joysticks that won't drift, and a decent amount of on-controller configuration that I actually really like. If you don't mind it feeling less premium, You're getting one hell of a deal here. Of course, those are my thoughts, but I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. What do you think of the PXN P5? Is this a controller you're interested in, or would you rather go with something a bit more premium like the Razer options, or maybe even a full custom one like a SCUF controller? Let me know in the comments down below. I will leave a link to this, to Amazon in particular, in the description if you're interested. And if you want to see more videos like this one, you can hit the subscribe button, check out the other controller reviews on the end cards, and like I said, if you want to check out the testing tools I use to test stuff like this, check out them at osrtt.com, linked in the description. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you on the next video.